Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. This story is narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it, and yeah.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. You've heard this before, countless times, the foundational truth of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. But there's another truth, one whispered in the quiet moments between battles, one that haunts the ancient halls of fortress monasteries across the Imperium. It's a truth about time, about what happens when warriors built to be immortal actually achieve something close to that terrible gift. Space Marines are humanity's finest warriors, genetically engineered superhumans, created to defend the Imperium of man against the countless horrors that lurk among the stars. They are stronger, faster, and more resilient than any normal human could ever hope to be. Their bodies have been rebuilt at the genetic level with 19 additional organs, each one granting them abilities that border on superhuman. They can spit acid, breathe toxic atmospheres, and survive wounds that would kill a normal person dozens of times over. Most importantly for our discussion today, they age very, very slowly. When a young boy is selected to become a Space Marine, he enters a process of transformation that will fundamentally alter every aspect of his being. The implantation of gene seed, those precious genetic templates, harvested from the Primarchs themselves, begins a cascade of changes that will turn him from a child into a living weapon. If he survives the process, and many do not, he will emerge as something more than human, but perhaps something less than what he once was. The Imperium tells these new warriors that they are blessed, that they have been elevated to serve the God Emperor for all time. And in a sense, this is true. A Space Marine's enhanced physiology means that he can, theoretically, live for centuries. Some say millennia. The oldest Space Marines in the Imperium have walked the galaxy for over 1,000 years, witnessing the rise and fall of entire civilizations, fighting in wars that began before their battle brothers were even born. But here's what the recruitment propaganda doesn't tell you, what the chaplains omit from their inspiring speeches, what even the chapter masters sometimes forget until they see it reflected in the eyes of their most ancient warriors. Living for centuries isn't a blessing. For a Space Marine, it's often a curse more terrible than any wound, any defeat, any failure in battle. The average Space Marine doesn't live long enough for this to matter. The galaxy is a hostile place, filled with enemies that want nothing more than to tear apart the Imperium and everything it stands for. Orcs mass in the millions, their crude weapons and savage cries overwhelming even the most stalwart defenses. Tyranids swarm across worlds like living tides, consuming everything in their path. Chaos. Space Marines bring corruption and damnation wherever they tread. The Eldar strike from nowhere with weapons of terrible beauty and precision. The Tau expand their empire with relentless efficiency, and these are just the known threats. The catalogued dangers that the Imperium has names for. Most Space Marines die in battle. This is not just likely, it's almost certain. They are thrown into the most desperate conflicts, the battles where nothing less than genetically enhanced superhumans will suffice. They hold the line when guardsmen break. They strike at the enemy's heart when mortal soldiers would die in the attempt. They are weapons, and weapons eventually break. The chapter serfs, who maintain the halls of remembrance in every fortress monastery, can tell you exactly how long the average Space Marine serves before he falls. Decades, usually. Sometimes only years for those unlucky enough to be deployed during particularly brutal campaigns. A Space Marine who reaches his 100th year of service is considered a veteran, someone whose experience is valuable enough to warrant preservation, if possible. One who reaches 200 years is ancient by most standards, a living repository of tactical knowledge and battlefield wisdom. But some live longer. Some Marines, through a combination of skill, luck, and the mysterious will of the Emperor himself, survive battle after battle, campaign after campaign, century after century. They become legends within their chapters, warriors whose names are spoken with reverence and whose presence on the battlefield inspires their brothers to acts of incredible heroism. And as they continue to live, as the years stretch into decades and the decades into centuries, something begins to change. It's subtle at first, so subtle that even the Marine himself might not notice. A slight hesitation before recalling a battle brother's name. A moment of confusion when trying to remember which campaign happened when. The faces of the dead start to blur together, becoming an indistinct mass of memories rather than individual people. The human brain, even one enhanced by the catalepsian node and other gene seed organs, was not designed to hold centuries of memories. It was not meant to process the deaths of thousands of comrades, to witness the same battles fought over and over again with only the names and planets changing. It was not built to maintain its humanity while living a life measured not in decades but in centuries. This is what we're going to explore today. Not the glory of the Space Marines, not their heroic victories or their noble sacrifices. Instead, we're going to look at what happens when the war goes on too long, when the warrior doesn't die at the appropriate time, when the Emperor's angels of death become something else entirely. Something older, something wearier, something that has forgotten what it means to be anything other than a weapon. We're going to talk about Space Marines who have lived too long. The biology of a Space Marine is a marvel of genetic engineering, a testament to the Emperor's genius and the dark sciences of the 31st millennium. When we talk about why Space Marines can live so long, we need to understand exactly what has been done to their bodies, what changes have been wrought at the cellular level to create these warriors. The process begins with the gene seed, that most precious commodity in the Imperium. Each chapter possesses gene seed derived from one of the Primarchs, those demigod sons of the Emperor who led the Great Crusade. This genetic material is implanted into a young aspirant through a series of 19 additional organs, each one serving a specific purpose in the transformation from human to Adeptus Astartes. Some of these organs are directly related to the extended lifespan that Space Marines enjoy. The secondary heart, the first organ implanted, doesn't just provide redundancy in case the original heart is damaged. It also enhances the efficiency of the cardiovascular system, ensuring that blood flows to every part of the body with greater effectiveness than in normal humans. This improved circulation means that cells receive oxygen and nutrients more efficiently, which in turn means they can function for longer periods without degrading. The osmodula and biscopia work together to strengthen bones and increase muscle mass. But more than that, they ensure that these tissues maintain their integrity far beyond what normal human biology would allow. A normal human's bones become brittle with age. Their muscles atrophy, their connective tissues wear down. A Space Marine's enhanced skeleton and musculature resist these effects, maintaining their strength and flexibility even as centuries pass. The preomnor and multi-lung allow a Space Marine to process toxins and breathe in environments that would kill a normal human. But they also mean that the accumulated environmental damage that causes aging in normal humans, the slow buildup of cellular damage from breathing polluted air and consuming imperfect food, is largely negated in Space Marines. Their bodies can process and eliminate these threats before they cause lasting harm. Perhaps most importantly, the gene seed seems to slow or even halt the normal aging process at the cellular level. The telomeres, those protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that shorten with each cell division and eventually lead to cellular death, appear to maintain their length in Space Marines. This is not fully understood, even by the most learned apothecaries and magos biologis. The Emperor's work in creating the Primarchs and their gene seed involve technologies and knowledge that have been lost to the Imperium, mysteries that may never be fully unraveled. The result is a being that, from a purely biological standpoint, should be able to live indefinitely. There are Space Marines who are over 1,000 years old and still physically capable of fighting. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels, for instance, has led his chapter for over 1,500 years. His body, while showing some signs of age, remains functional, capable of the same feats of strength and endurance that he displayed in his youth. But here's where the biology becomes complicated, where the theoretical immortality granted by gene seed enhancements runs into the reality of what it means to be a living being in a hostile universe. The brain is the most complex organ in the human body, and while the Space Marine enhancement process includes several organs that affect cognitive function, the catalepsian node that allows them to rest one hemisphere at a time, the oculobe that improves vision and processing of visual information. None of these organs fundamentally change the fact that the brain is still, at its core, biological tissue, subject to the limitations of organic matter. Memory is not infinite. The human brain, even enhanced, has a finite capacity to store and retrieve information. When a space marine lives for centuries, fighting in countless battles, losing hundreds or thousands of battle brothers, witnessing the deaths of entire populations, participating in campaigns that span decades, the sheer volume of experiences begins to overwhelm the brain's ability to properly catalogue and maintain them all. Think about your own memory. You can probably remember significant events from your life with reasonable clarity: your first day of school, important milestones, traumatic experiences. But can you remember every single day? Every conversation you've had? Every person you've met? Of course not. The brain prioritizes, keeping what seems important and discarding or compressing what seems less so. Now imagine trying to remember 1,000 years' worth of experiences. Imagine trying to maintain distinct memories of 10,000 battles, 100,000 dead comrades, entire lifetimes lived and lost while you continue on. The brain simply cannot do it, not without losing something in the process. What gets lost first are the emotional connections. The feeling of grief at a battle brother's death, sharp and painful the first 100 times, becomes dulled after the 1,000th. The sense of victory after a hard-fought campaign, exhilarating in youth, becomes merely another entry in a long list of objectives achieved. The fear before battle, that edge of adrenaline that keeps a warrior sharp, fades into mechanical preparation and routine. The very old space marines, those who have lived for many centuries, often describe a sensation of emotional numbness. They go through the motions of caring because they know intellectually that they should care, but the actual feeling has become distant, like a memory of emotion rather than the thing itself. They can remember that they once felt strongly about their chapter, about their battle brothers, about the Imperium itself, but the passion has been worn away by time and repetition. This is one of the reasons why the Imperium doesn't simply keep Space Marines alive indefinitely through any means necessary. A warrior who no longer feels anything, who goes into battle without the fire of righteous fury or the steel of determination, is a warrior who has lost something essential. They may still function, still fight, still kill the Emperor's enemies, but they've become more machine than man. And while the Adeptus Mechanicus might approve of this transformation, there's a reason even the most battle-hardened Space Marines fear becoming too much like the servitors that attend them. The physical body may remain strong, the gene seed may continue to function, the organs may sustain life for centuries or even millennia, but the mind, that ineffable quality that makes a Space Marine more than just a very efficient killing machine, that mind has limits that even the Emperor's genetic engineering couldn't entirely overcome. And we haven't even talked about dreadnoughts yet. If there's a single symbol of what it means to live too long as a Space Marine, it's the dreadnought. These massive war machines, towering over even their fellow Space Marines, are simultaneously objects of reverence and sources of deep, unspoken horror within every chapter. To understand dreadnoughts, you need to understand what it takes to become one. A Space Marine must be mortally wounded, injured so severely that even their enhanced physiology cannot repair the damage. We're talking about catastrophic trauma here, the kind of injuries where limbs are gone, organs are pulped, the spine is shattered, the body is simply too broken to continue functioning in any meaningful way. For a normal human, these injuries would mean death, pure and simple. For a Space Marine, they should mean death too. The gene seed would be harvested by the apothecaries, preserved for the next generation of warriors, and the Marine would be granted the Emperor's peace, released from his suffering to join his brothers in whatever afterlife awaits the faithful. But some Marines are deemed too valuable to lose. Perhaps they possess centuries of tactical knowledge that the chapter cannot afford to lose. Perhaps they are heroes whose names inspire entire generations of warriors. Perhaps they simply happened to fall in battle at a time when dreadnought sarcophagi were available, and the chapter's tech marines had the resources to perform the sacred ritual of entombment. Whatever the reason, these marines are not allowed to die. Instead, they undergo a process that can only be described as a violation of the natural order, a perversion of death itself, disguised as an honor. The marine's broken body is cut away until only the essential parts remain. The brain and brainstem, obviously, along with whatever organs are still functional and can be sustained within the confines of the dreadnought's sarcophagus. The spinal column is preserved if possible. Some dreadnoughts retain their hearts, their lungs, kept alive by arcane life support systems that blend technology and the prayers of the machine god. Others are reduced to little more than a brain in a jar, their consciousness the only thing that survives the transition. What remains of the Space Marine is then interred within the sarcophagus, a armored shell that will serve as both life support and prison for however long the Marine continues to exist. This sarcophagus is connected to the dreadnought chassis, a bipedal war machine armed with weapons far more powerful than anything a normal Space Marine could carry. Assault cannons, las cannons, missile launchers, power fists the size of a small vehicle. The dreadnought is a walking fortress, an engine of destruction that can turn the tide of entire battles. The chapter's tech marines and chaplains tell the newly interred Marine that this is an honor, that he has been given a chance to continue serving the Emperor in a new form. They speak of the glory of eternal service, of the wisdom he will be able to share with future generations, of the fear he will inspire in the Emperor's enemies. They don't talk about what it actually feels like to be a dreadnought. Imagine, for a moment, that you have been reduced to a brain in a box. You have no body, not in any real sense. You cannot feel the ground beneath your feet because you have no feet. You cannot breathe because you have no lungs. Or if you do have lungs, they're being mechanically inflated and deflated by machines that care nothing for your comfort. You cannot touch anything with your hands because your hands are weapon systems, and every sensation is filtered through mechanical sensors that translate physical contact into data streams that your brain struggles to interpret as actual feeling. You cannot smell. You cannot taste. You cannot feel the wind on your skin, or the warmth of the sun, or the cold of winter. All of these sensory experiences, the things that make embodiment meaningful, are gone. Instead, you receive data, temperature readings, atmospheric composition analysis, tactical information. Everything is mediated through machines, translated into a format your biological brain can process, but fundamentally divorced from the direct experience of being alive. And then there's the sleep. Dreadnoughts are not kept active at all times. The psychol strain of existence in this form is too great, the risk of madness too high. When a dreadnought is not needed for battle, when the chapter has no immediate use for the massive amount of resources required to keep one active and functional, the occupant is put into a form of suspended animation. The life support systems dial down to minimal levels. The brain is induced into a state that's not quite sleep and not quite death, a void of consciousness where time has no meaning. The dreadnought might wake a few weeks later for the next battle, or a few months, or a few years, or, in some cases, a few decades or even centuries. The oldest dreadnoughts have been asleep for longer than they've been awake. They experience existence not as a continuous stream, but as a series of violent interruptions. Wake up, fight a battle, go back to sleep. Wake up, discover that everyone you knew is dead. Fight another battle, go back to sleep. Wake up, find that the very architecture of your chapter's fortress monastery has changed, that new traditions have been established, that the Imperium itself has shifted in ways you cannot fully comprehend. Fight a battle. Go back to sleep. Bjorn, the Fell-Handed, the oldest dreadnought in the Space Wolves chapter, and quite possibly the oldest in the entire Imperium, has been interred for over 10,000 years. He was a warrior during the Horus Heresy itself, fought alongside the Primarch Leman Russ, witnessed the beginning of the Imperium's long nightmare. He has been asleep for so much of that time that his total waking hours might only add up to a few decades, if that. When Bjorn wakes, he speaks of brothers long dead, of battles fought when the Imperium was young. The Space Wolves revere him, seek his counsel. Consider his words to be precious gifts from a living connection to their founding. But read the accounts carefully. Listen to the way Bjorn's recorded statements are phrased, and you can detect something beneath the wisdom, a weariness, a longing for rest that will never be granted, a quiet desperation that no amount of reverence can truly mask. Bjorn is not unique in this regard. Every chapter has its honored ancients, dreadnoughts who have served for centuries or millennia, and every single one of them, if you could truly understand their perspective, would tell you the same thing. This is not an honor. This is a curse. The psychological effects of dreadnought existence are profound and multifaceted. First, there's the disconnection from humanity. A dreadnought cannot engage in the small social rituals that bind battle brothers together. They cannot share a meal, cannot train alongside their brothers in the same way, cannot participate in the countless informal interactions that create camaraderie and esprit de corps. They exist apart, revered but isolated, honored but alone. Then there's the temporal dislocation. Waking up after decades or centuries of sleep means that the world has moved on without you. Battle brothers you knew are dead. Traditions have changed. New enemies have emerged, while old ones have been forgotten. You are a relic, a living piece of history that no longer quite fits into the present moment. Everything you say is filtered through the understanding that you are speaking from another age, and while your words may be valued for their historical perspective, they are not always relevant to current circumstances. The memories begin to fragment. Each sleep cycle is like a small death, and waking up is like being reborn into a world that's slightly different from the one you left. Over time, over many cycles of sleep and waking, the continuity of experience breaks down. Memories from different eras blend together. You start to confuse one battle with another, one brother with another, one century with another. The linear progression of time, that fundamental way that humans organize their experience of reality, becomes meaningless. Some dreadnoughts cope with this by retreating into their tactical functions. They focus entirely on the mechanical aspects of warfare, reducing each battle to a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be lived. This is efficient, and the chapter appreciates their effectiveness. But it also means that the Marine inside the dreadnought is actively choosing to become more machine-like, to embrace the shell they've been placed in, rather than maintaining the humanity they once possessed. Others try to hold on to their humanity by remembering. They recite the names of fallen battle brothers like mantras. They tell stories of ancient battles, rehearsing the details over and over to keep them fresh. They engage with younger Marines, trying to pass on not just tactical knowledge, but something of the person they used to be. But this is fighting against an inevitable tide. The memories will fade. The stories will be told so many times that they become rote recitations rather than genuine remembrances. The humanity will slip away bit by bit until what's left is just an echo, a ghost haunting a machine. The most disturbing accounts come from apothecaries and tech marines who attend to the dreadnoughts between battles. They speak of hearing sounds from within the sarcophagi during maintenance, sounds that might be weeping if such a thing were possible for a being with no tear ducts, no diaphragm to produce sobs. They describe error messages in the life support systems that suggest the occupant is experiencing severe psychological distress, panic responses in a body that no longer has the capability to physically manifest panic. And yet, the entombment continues. Every chapter maintains at least a few dreadnought chassis, and when a sufficiently valuable Marine falls with the right kind of injuries at the right time, the ritual is performed. The Marine is placed into his tomb. The prayers are said, and another consciousness is condemned to an existence that stretches beyond the boundaries of what any mind should have to endure. Because here's the final cruelty. A dreadnought cannot die easily. The sarcophagus is heavily armored, designed to protect the precious gene seed and the irreplaceable knowledge contained within. The dreadnought's weapons and armor make it one of the most formidable units on any battlefield. It would take an extraordinary amount of firepower to destroy one, and even then, the chapter will fight to recover the sarcophagus, to preserve what they can.
I have to pause here for a moment because researching this topic genuinely affected me in ways I didn't expect. When I started putting this script together, I've been covering Warhammer 40K lore, right? And I thought I understood the grim dark nature of the setting, but digging deep into what happens to a space marine who lives too long, it hits different. We always talk about how cool dreadnoughts are, right? These massive walking tanks with ancient warriors inside, but I'd never really sat down and thought about what that existence actually means. I think what struck me most while putting this together is realizing that the legendary hero who led the Blood Angels for 1500 years openly wants to die. He's just tired, he's done, he's given everything and he just wants to rest. And the Imperium won't let him because he's too valuable. Anyway, I just needed to share that because it's genuinely pretty cool. They're still badass, they're still the Emperor's finest, but there's this whole layer of tragedy underneath that I'd never fully appreciated. Anyways, let's continue.
Death, the release that comes to all other Space Marines eventually, is denied to the Dreadnought. They continue on, battle after battle, century after century, slowly losing pieces of themselves until what remains is more myth than man, more weapon than warrior, more machine than anything that was ever alive. And through it all, they cannot scream, they cannot weep, they cannot even look at their own reflection and see what they've become. They can only continue to serve, because service is all they have left, the only purpose that gives meaning to an existence that has long since ceased to be life in any meaningful sense. This is what happens when a Space Marine lives too long, in the most literal, most physical way possible. But even for those who never enter a dreadnought, even for those who remain in their original bodies, the psychological toll of extended life is no less devastating. Let's talk about what centuries of war do to the mind. Even a mind enhanced by gene seed and hardened by the most rigorous training the Imperium can provide. Human psychology, at its core, is built around certain assumptions about the nature of existence. We expect to live for a certain amount of time, measured in decades rather than centuries. We form attachments to other people with the understanding that those attachments will last for a portion of our lifetime, not for a fraction of it. We build our identities around experiences and relationships that we assume will remain relatively stable over the course of our existence. A Space Marine who lives for centuries has all of these assumptions violated repeatedly, relentlessly, until the fundamental structures of psychological stability begin to crack. Consider the simple matter of relationships. When a young Space Marine joins his chapter, he bonds with his battle brothers in his squad. These are the men he trains with, fights alongside, trusts with his life. The bonds formed in combat are some of the strongest that humans can experience. There's a reason that veterans from mortal military forces often say that the relationships they formed during war were more intense, more meaningful, than anything they experienced before or after. For a few decades, these bonds sustain the young Space Marine. His squad becomes his family, his brothers in the truest sense. He learns their quirks, their strengths, their weaknesses. He develops an almost telepathic understanding of how they'll move in combat, what decisions they'll make, how they'll react to any given situation. This is good for the chapter, good for combat effectiveness, and good for the Marine's psychological well-being. Then his brothers start to die. It might be quick, an unlucky shot that penetrates their armor and ends them instantly. It might be slow, grievous wounds sustained in battle that even the apothecary cannot fully heal, leading to a lingering death in the chapter's infirmary. It might be heroic, a last stand against impossible odds while the rest of the squad escapes. However it happens, the deaths begin, and they don't stop. The first few deaths are devastating. The Marine grieves, genuinely and deeply. He attends the funeral rites, speaks of his fallen brother with reverence and sorrow, promises to honor his memory by continuing to serve the Emperor, and he means it. The pain is real, the loss profound. But then more brothers die, and more, and more. The squad is replenished with new Marines, fresh faces eager to prove themselves. The veteran bonds with them too, because that's what you do. You trust your squad mates, you fight alongside them, you build those relationships because your life and theirs depend on it. And then they die too. Decades pass. The veteran has now lost multiple entire squads worth of battle brothers. He's attended hundreds of funeral rites. He's spoken thousands of words of remembrance. He's promised to honor the memories of so many fallen brothers that he's starting to have trouble remembering their faces individually. More time passes. Centuries now. The veteran has outlived everyone he originally served with. Not just his squad, but his entire company. Then everyone from his generation of recruits. Then everyone from the next generation too. He's now fighting alongside Space Marines, who weren't even born when he first donned his power armor. And here's where the psychology starts to break down. You cannot sustain genuine grief for thousands of dead comrades. The human mind simply cannot do it. The emotional capacity isn't there. So the mind adapts. It has to. It learns to protect itself from the pain of repeated loss by not forming attachments quite as deeply, by maintaining a small emotional distance even from those you fight beside, by treating relationships as temporary arrangements rather than permanent bonds. This is a survival mechanism, and it works. The veteran can continue to function, can continue to fight effectively, can continue to serve the chapter, but something has been lost in the process. The intense camaraderie that defined his early service, that feeling of brotherhood that made the Space Marines more than just efficient killers, that's gone. It's been replaced with something colder, more professional, more distant. The veteran knows this has happened. He can remember what it felt like to truly care about his battle brothers, to feel their losses as personal tragedies rather than tactical setbacks. But he can't get that feeling back, no matter how hard he tries. He goes through the motions of brotherhood because he knows it's important for the chapter, for morale, for combat effectiveness. But it's become a performance rather than a genuine experience. Then there's the matter of memory itself. We touched on this earlier, but it bears exploring in greater detail. The human brain stores memories through complex patterns of neural connections. When you recall a memory, you're not accessing a perfect recording of past events. You're reconstructing an experience based on fragments of stored information, filling in gaps with assumptions and interpretations. This process works reasonably well for normal human lifespans. But when you're trying to remember events that occurred hundreds of years ago, when the volume of experiences you've had is so vast that individual moments blur together, the reconstruction process becomes increasingly unreliable. A veteran Space Marine might remember a particular battle, but he can't quite recall whether it was fought on this icy world or that one, whether it was against orcs or chaos cultists, whether his squad leader was Brother Sergeant Marcus or Brother Sergeant Marcius. The broad strokes remain, the tactical lessons are preserved, but the specific details that make a memory feel real and immediate, those are gone. This creates a strange sense of temporal dislocation. The veteran knows intellectually that he has lived for centuries, but his actual felt experience of time is fragmented and compressed. Some decades seem to have passed in an instant, barely leaving any trace in his memory. Other brief moments of intense combat remain crystal clear, as vivid as if they happened yesterday. The linear progression of time, that organizing principle that helps humans make sense of their lives, becomes meaningless. Some veteran Marines cope with this by keeping detailed personal logs, written records of every battle, every fallen brother, every significant event. They review these logs regularly, trying to maintain some sense of continuity with their past selves. But even this has its limitations. Reading about an event you experienced but can't remember creates a weird dissonance. Did this really happen to me? Was I really there? The person described in these logs, did they really fight that battle, make that decision, feel those emotions? Or is it a story about someone else? Someone who wore my armor and bore my name, but was fundamentally different from who I am now. The erosion of memory goes hand in hand with the erosion of identity. Who are you, really, if you can't remember most of your own life? If the experiences that shaped you have faded into indistinct fragments? If the person you were a century ago made decisions based on values and perspectives that you can no longer fully recall or understand? Chapter chaplains try to address this issue through various means. They encourage regular meditation and prayer, practices designed to help Marines maintain a stable sense of self across extended time spans. They emphasize the continuity of service to the Emperor, the idea that even if memories fade and perspectives change, the fundamental purpose remains constant. They create rituals and traditions that give structure to time, annual commemorations, and cyclical practices that help mark the passage of years in meaningful ways. But these are, at best, partial solutions to an insoluble problem. You cannot make a human mind function optimally across timescales. It was never designed to handle. The best you can do is manage the degradation, slow the inevitable decline, and hope that the Marine remains functional for as long as the chapter needs them. And then there's the ultimate psychological cost, the one that's rarely spoken of but universally understood among the very old Marines. The complete and total exhaustion that comes from fighting an endless war. Battle fatigue is well documented in mortal military forces. Soldiers who see too much combat, who experience too much stress over too long a period, eventually break. Their minds cannot sustain the constant alertness, the perpetual danger, the repeated exposure to death and destruction. They develop what ancient texts called shell shock, what later generations termed post-traumatic stress disorder. They become unable to function effectively in combat, and if they're lucky, they're pulled from the front lines and given time to recover. Space Marines are supposed to be immune to this. Their psychological conditioning, combined with their gene seed enhancements and their fanatical faith in the Emperor, should allow them to endure any amount of combat stress without breaking. And for the most part, this is true. A Space Marine can fight through circumstances that would shatter the sanity of any mortal soldier. But even Space Marines have limits. Those limits are just much, much higher than for normal humans, which means that by the time a Space Marine reaches them, by the time the cracks start to show, they've already endured far more than any being should have to. The signs are subtle at first. A slight hesitation before charging into battle, just a fraction of a second, where the veteran considers whether this fight is really necessary. A moment of irritation at the zealous enthusiasm of younger battle brothers, at their eagerness for glory and combat. A sense of weary resignation rather than righteous fury when facing yet another enemy that needs to be destroyed. These small moments accumulate over centuries. The veteran finds himself going through the motions of pre-battle rituals without really engaging with their meaning. The prayers to the Emperor become rote recitations rather than sincere devotions. The maintenance of his weapons and armor becomes a mechanical task rather than a sacred duty. He's still effective in combat, still capable of slaughtering the Emperor's enemies with practiced efficiency, but the fire that once drove him has been reduced to embers. In the most extreme cases, the exhaustion becomes overwhelming. The veteran looks out at the galaxy and sees only endless war stretching into an infinite future. He sees new threats constantly emerging, old enemies regrouping and returning, battles that will be fought again and again, with only the names and locations changing. He sees his brothers dying in the same ways, making the same sacrifices, winning the same victories that mean nothing in the grand scheme of things because the war never ends. This is when a Space Marine starts to understand what it truly means to have lived too long. It's not about the physical degradation of the body, though that certainly plays a role. It's not even about the psychological trauma of repeated loss and fragmented memory, though those are devastating in their own right. It's about reaching a point where you've fought for so long, seen so much, endured so much, that you simply don't have the capacity to care anymore, where the only thing that keeps you going is the momentum of centuries of service, the habits and routines so deeply ingrained that you continue to function even after the reasons for functioning have long since ceased to have any meaning. Some veteran Space Marines, when they reach this point, actively seek death in battle, not through cowardice or despair, but simply because they're tired. They've served long enough, seen enough, done enough. They want rest, and the only rest available to a Space Marine is the final rest of death. They volunteer for the most dangerous missions, take the most suicidal positions, charge into situations where survival is unlikely, and if they're fortunate, they find the honorable death they're seeking, their gene seed harvested for the next generation, their names added to the rolls of honored dead. But some don't find that death. Some continue to survive, battle after battle, century after century, their skill and experience and sheer gene-enhanced durability, keeping them alive even when they no longer wish to be. These are the Marines who have truly lived too long, who have reached the point where existence itself has become a burden rather than a blessing. And the Imperium, with its endless need for warriors, with its desperate struggle against countless threats, continues to keep them in service, continues to deploy them to war zones across the galaxy, continues to extract every last drop of utility from their existence before finally allowing them the peace of death. This is the psychological cost of living too long as a Space Marine. Not dramatic madness or spectacular breakdowns, but a slow, grinding erosion of everything that makes existence meaningful, until all that's left is an empty shell going through the motions of a life that ended decades or centuries ago. The Imperium has living examples of what happens when Space Marines accumulate centuries of service, and examining these individuals provides concrete illustrations of the abstract principles we've been discussing. These are the named heroes, the chapter masters, and company champions, whose deeds are recorded in official histories, whose continued existence shapes the policies and cultures of their chapters. And each of them, in their own way, demonstrates the terrible cost of extended life. Commander Dante, of the Blood Angels, is perhaps the most famous example. As of the current era, he has served as chapter master for over 1,500 years, making him one of the oldest non-dreadnought Space Marines in the Imperium. His tactical genius is unquestioned, his dedication to the Emperor absolute, his leadership instrumental in preserving the Blood Angels through some of their darkest hours. He is also, by all accounts, desperately tired. The official histories speak of Dante's wisdom, his patience, his measured approach to leadership. What they often omit is the weariness that permeates every aspect of his existence. Dante himself has been recorded expressing the desire for death, not from despair, but from simple exhaustion. He has served for so long, fought in so many battles, buried so many battle brothers, that the thought of continuing indefinitely fills him with something approaching dread. There's a telling detail in some of the accounts of Dante's appearance. Despite the fact that Space Marines age very slowly, despite the fact that his gene seed should keep him physically vigorous for millennia, Dante shows visible signs of age. His hair, what little is visible beneath his death mask, is white. His face, on the rare occasions he removes his helmet, bears lines and weathering that speak of the centuries he's endured. His movements, while still precise and deadly, carry a heaviness that has nothing to do with his armor. These physical manifestations of age shouldn't be possible for a Space Marine of Dante's relatively young age, speaking in terms of what the gene seed should theoretically allow. The fact that they exist anyway suggests that something beyond mere biology is at work here. The psychological burden of leadership, the weight of countless decisions made over 15 centuries, the accumulated stress of unending war, all of these have somehow manifested physically in ways that gene seed enhancements cannot fully prevent. And yet Dante continues to serve. He continues because the Blood Angels need him, because his chapter looks to him for guidance, because stepping down would mean abandoning brothers who depend on his leadership. He is trapped not by literal chains, but by duty, by honor, by the knowledge that his experience and wisdom are too valuable to the Imperium to be surrendered simply because he's tired. Other chapters have their own ancient heroes, each demonstrating different facets of the curse of longevity. Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves has led his chapter for over 700 years, and while he maintains the fierce vigor associated with his chapter's culture, there are moments described in the accounts where something darker shows through. A flash of irritation at yet another conflict, yet another threat, yet another battle in an endless succession of battles. The Great Wolf is a warrior born, but even the most dedicated warrior can grow weary of war that never ends. The older a chapter master becomes, the more they begin to resemble something other than the Space Marine they once were. They accumulate not just experience but a kind of weight, a gravitas that comes from having witnessed the sweep of history firsthand. They speak with the authority of those who have seen the same mistakes made repeatedly across centuries. They make decisions with the cold calculation of those who have learned that sentiment is a luxury that costs lives. This transformation is both necessary and tragic. Necessary because the Imperium needs leaders who can think in terms of centuries, who can make the hard choices that preserve the chapter over the long term, rather than seeking glory in the immediate moment. Tragic because it requires the suppression or loss of qualities that made these Marines human in the first place. Consider the tactical decisions that an ancient chapter master must make. He knows, from centuries of experience, that certain types of missions will result in predictable casualty rates. He knows that deploying Company A to this war zone will likely result in 30% casualties, while deploying Company B will result in 25% casualties, but take twice as long to achieve objectives. These aren't abstract statistics to him. He knows the Marines in these companies, has fought alongside many of them, has personally selected and trained some of them. A younger leader might struggle with this, might feel the weight of sending battle brothers to their likely deaths. An ancient chapter master makes the calculation, chooses the option that best serves the chapter's long-term interests, and moves on to the next decision. He has made this choice hundreds, perhaps thousands of times before. He will make it thousands of times again. The individual lives, while not meaningless, cannot be allowed to interfere with strategic necessity. This is efficient. This is what the Imperium needs. But it also represents a kind of death. A death of the capacity to feel the full weight of these decisions, to truly grapple with the moral implications of treating battle brothers as expendable resources. The ancient chapter master has not become cruel or callous in the traditional sense. He has simply survived so long, made so many similar decisions, that the emotional impact has been worn away through repetition. The isolation of command compounds this effect. A chapter master, especially one who has served for centuries, cannot truly be friends with those under his command. The gap in age and experience is too great. His perspective, shaped by centuries of war, is too different from that of younger Marines. He makes decisions that will send some of them to their deaths, which creates a necessary distance. And the simple fact that he will outlive most or all of them means that forming genuine attachments is a path to endless grief. So the ancient chapter master becomes isolated, surrounded by battle brothers who revere him but cannot truly know him, cannot understand the weight he carries. He shares his burden with no one because there is no one who could fully comprehend it. He continues to lead because that is his function, his purpose, the only thing that gives structure to an existence that has long since ceased to offer any kind of personal fulfillment. Some chapters attempt to address this by rotating leadership, ensuring that no one individual bears the burden for too long. But this creates its own problems. A chapter master who knows he will eventually step down might make different decisions than one who expects to lead until death. The continuity of leadership, the long-term vision that centuries of experience provides, is lost if chapter masters serve only for decades rather than centuries. And some Marines are simply too valuable to replace. Dante could theoretically step down, appoint a successor, and finally seek the death in battle that he desires. But the Blood Angels are one of the most troubled chapters in the Imperium, beset by genetic curses that threaten their very survival. Dante's experience in managing these curses, his deep understanding of his chapter's unique challenges, his wisdom accumulated over 15 centuries of leadership, all of this is irreplaceable. To lose him would be to lose institutional knowledge that cannot be recovered, cannot be passed on in its entirety, no matter how detailed the records or how thorough the succession planning. So Dante continues to serve, and will likely continue to serve until he finally falls in battle, or until the genetic curses that plague his chapter finally claim him. He is a prisoner of his own excellence, trapped by the very qualities that make him invaluable to the Imperium. And he is not alone. Every chapter has its ancients, its veterans who have served far longer than any human should have to serve. Some embrace this role, finding meaning in their endless service. Others endure it stoically, accepting their fate without complaint. And some, like Dante, carry their burden with visible weariness, longing for a rest that seems increasingly unlikely to ever come. These living legends demonstrate that the curse of longevity isn't about physical degradation or mechanical existence. It's about the slow erosion of self that comes from living too long in a universe where war is the only constant, where every victory is temporary and every defeat potentially permanent, where the only certainty is that the fighting will continue long after you've grown too tired to care about the outcome. If the loyal Space Marines, who live for centuries, demonstrate one form of the curse of longevity, the Chaos Space Marines, who have survived since the Horus Heresy, represent its ultimate expression. These warriors have not merely lived for centuries, they have endured for 10,000 years, sustained by the dark powers of the warp and the twisted blessings of the Chaos Gods. To understand what this means, we need to put 10,000 years into perspective. The Horus Heresy, that great civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium, ended in the early 31st millennium. The current era is the late 41st millennium. The gap between these 2 points is roughly equivalent to the entire span of recorded human history on ancient Terra, from the first written texts to the Age of Strife. Everything that has happened in human civilization, every empire that has risen and fallen, every achievement and catastrophe would fit comfortably within this time span. And throughout this entire period, the traitor legions have continued to exist, to fight, to pursue their endless war against the Imperium they once served. Some have done so continuously, maintaining a constant presence in real space and actively campaigning against Imperial forces. Others have spent much of this time within the Eye of Terror or other warp rifts, where time flows differently and 10,000 years might pass as a subjective century or less. But regardless of how they've experienced the passage of time, regardless of whether they've aged those 10 millennia day by day or in compressed bursts, the fact remains that these are beings who have been alive since before the Imperium took its current form, who remember the Emperor as a living presence rather than a corpse on a throne, who fought in the Great Crusade and witnessed the galaxy before the Long War began. What does this do to a mind? What happens to a consciousness that endures for such a vast span of time? The answer is nothing good. First, there's the matter of the warp itself. Chaos Space Marines are not sustained by gene seed alone. They've been touched by the energies of chaos, blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, by entities that exist outside normal reality. These blessings often include extended life, the ability to survive wounds that would kill even a normal Space Marine, and a kind of immortality that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the will of fickle gods. But this immortality comes at a cost. The warp does not preserve things unchanged. It mutates them, corrupts them, twists them into forms that reflect the nature of the Chaos Gods they serve. A Chaos Space Marine might live for 10,000 years, but they won't do so as the warrior they once were. Their body will change, sometimes slowly, sometimes catastrophically. Extra limbs might sprout from their torso. Their armor might fuse with their flesh, becoming an inseparable part of their body. Their face might transform into something that only barely resembles human features. These physical mutations are accompanied by psychological changes. The Chaos Gods are not benevolent patrons. They are predatory entities that feed on emotion and concept. Khorne feeds on rage and bloodshed. Nurgle feeds on despair and entropy. Tsiench feeds on ambition and change. Slaanesh feeds on excess and sensation. A Chaos Space Marine who dedicates themselves to one of these powers will find their personality gradually reshaped to better serve their patron's nature. A warrior who once fought with controlled aggression becomes a berserker who knows only rage. A Marine who once planned careful strategies becomes consumed by schemes within schemes, plotting for the sake of plotting rather than any coherent goal. A fighter who once took pride in his skill becomes obsessed with sensation, seeking ever more extreme experiences to feel anything at all through the numbing fog of corruption. This isn't a choice. Not really. It's a gradual transformation that happens over centuries or millennia, so slowly that the Marine might not even realize how much they've changed until they try to remember who they used to be and find only fragments of a person who no longer exists. Then there's the matter of memory. We've discussed how normal Space Marines struggle with memory across centuries. For Chaos Space Marines, this problem is compounded exponentially. The warp is inherently hostile to linear time. Memories of events can become jumbled, out of sequence, or corrupted by the intrusive presence of warp entities. A Chaos Marine might remember a battle they fought 1,000 years ago, but they remember it wrong, with details that never happened, with participants who weren't there, with outcomes that differ from reality. Some Chaos Marines cope with this by giving up on accurate memory entirely. They let the past become myth, accepting that they can no longer distinguish between what really happened and what the warp has made them believe happened. They exist in an eternal present, fighting battles that blur together into an endless war, where the specific details no longer matter. Others desperately try to hold on to their original memories, recording everything, rehearsing events over and over to keep them fresh. But even this is a losing battle. The corruption seeps in anyway, distorting the records, changing the rehearsals, until what they're preserving is a warped version of the past rather than the truth. The oldest Chaos Space Marines have lived so long, experienced so much temporal distortion, undergone so many mutations, both physical and mental, that they've essentially become different beings entirely. They might retain the name they once bore, might remember fragments of the warrior they used to be, but the continuity of identity has been shattered beyond repair. They are not the same person who fought in the Horus heresy. They are what's left after 10,000 years of corruption, degradation, and the relentless pressure of the warp has ground away everything that once made them who they were. Consider Fabius Bile, the Clone Lord, once an apothecary of the Emperor's children, and now one of the most infamous renegades in the galaxy. He has survived since the heresy through a combination of genetic manipulation, cloning technology, and dark pacts. The current Fabius Bile walking the galaxy is not even the original. He's a clone of a clone of a clone, each iteration carrying the memories of the previous one, but also introducing small changes, small degradations. He knows this. He's aware that he's not really Fabius Bile anymore, just the latest copy. And yet he continues, driven by an obsession that has transcended the individual identity of the being experiencing it. Or consider Khan the Betrayer, champion of Khorne. The warrior who once fought alongside the Primarch Angron has been reduced to a creature that exists only for slaughter. He kills without discrimination, without mercy, without any of the tactical acumen he once possessed. He is rage incarnate, a being so consumed by bloodlust that he has become functionally indistinguishable from a daemon, despite still possessing a physical body. The person he used to be is gone, consumed by millennia of violence and the overwhelming influence of his patron god. These are extreme examples, but they illustrate a broader truth about Chaos Space Marines who live too long. They become things rather than people, concepts given flesh rather than individuals with agency and identity. They are anger, or ambition, or despair, or excess, expressed through a form that was once human, but has been so thoroughly corrupted that the original template is almost unrecognizable. And unlike loyal Space Marines, who can at least hope for the release of death in battle, Chaos Space Marines often cannot die easily. Their patrons keep them alive, repairing wounds that should be fatal, restoring them to function after devastating injuries, pulling them back from the brink of destruction because they remain useful. Death, which for a loyal Marine is the ultimate rest, becomes for a Chaos Marine just another thing to endure, another resurrection, another return to an existence that should have ended millennia ago. There are accounts, fragmentary and disturbing, of Chaos Marines who beg for death, not in the heat of battle, not as a dramatic gesture, but in moments of lucidity where they understand what they've become and desperately want it to end. These accounts are suppressed by Imperial authorities, considered too dangerous to be widely known, but they exist in the records of the Inquisition. Warriors who have served chaos for thousands of years, who have committed atrocities beyond counting, who have been so transformed by corruption that they barely resemble anything human, pleading with their enemies to finish them, to grant them the oblivion that their own gods will not allow. The tragedy is that even when such Marines are killed, they don't necessarily stay dead. The Chaos Gods can resurrect their favored servants, pulling their souls from the warp and forcing them back into physical form. The death that should be a release becomes just another torment, another demonstration that they are no longer in control of their own existence, that they belong to powers far greater and far more terrible than themselves. This is what 10,000 years of life as a Chaos Space Marine looks like. Not glory, not power, not the freedom that the traitor legions supposedly fought for during the heresy. Just corruption, degradation, and an existence so prolonged and so warped that death becomes not something to be feared, but something to be desperately desired and eternally denied. The loyal Space Marines who live for centuries may endure weariness and isolation and the slow erosion of their humanity, but at least they remain themselves. At least they can hope for eventual rest. At least they serve something beyond their own degradation. The Chaos Marines have none of these consolations. They have only the endless war and the knowledge that they are trapped in it forever, transformed beyond recognition, denied even the mercy of final death. This is the ultimate expression of living too long in Warhammer 40,000. Not merely to accumulate years, but to do so in service to powers that will never let you go, that will keep you fighting and suffering and changing until the being you once were is completely erased, and all that's left is a weapon in hands that care nothing for your well-being. Some chapters face unique challenges when their Marines live too long, challenges rooted in the specific genetic legacies of their Primarchs and the mutations that can emerge over time. These chapter-specific afflictions add additional layers to the horror of extended life, transforming what might be manageable conditions in youth into overwhelming curses in old age. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters present perhaps the most well-documented case of genetic afflictions that worsen with time. All Space Marines, derived from Sanguinius's gene seed, carry two distinct but related curses, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. The Red Thirst is a vampiric urge, a craving for blood that can overcome a Blood Angel in the heat of battle or during moments of extreme stress. Young Marines learn to control this urge through discipline and faith, channeling it into righteous fury against the Emperor's enemies. For a time, this works. The thirst remains manageable, a dark edge to their combat effectiveness, but not something that overwhelms their rational mind. But the thirst grows stronger with age. A Blood Angel who has fought for centuries finds that the craving becomes harder to resist, that the discipline that once contained it begins to fray. The rituals and prayers that helped in youth become less effective. The control that seemed second nature starts to slip. And there's a terrible awareness that this is only going to get worse. That with each passing decade, the thirst will become more demanding, more insistent, more difficult to deny. Then there's the Black Rage, perhaps the most terrible of all Space Marine afflictions. This is a psychic echo of Sanguinius's death at the hands of Horus during the heresy. Blood Angels who succumb to the Black Rage believe themselves to be their Primarch, reliving his final moments in an endless loop of rage and despair. They lose all sense of their own identity, seeing only the War Master before them, feeling only the need to strike him down even as they know they will fail because Sanguinius failed. The Black Rage can strike at any time, but it becomes more likely as a Blood Angel ages. The young Marines are relatively safe, protected by their fresh gene seed and strong connection to their own identity. But the older they get, the more battles they fight, the more they witness death and betrayal and the endless grinding horror of the long war, the more vulnerable they become to the psychic wound that killed their Primarch 10,000 years ago. There is no cure for the Black Rage. Once it claims a Blood Angel, that Marine is lost. He is placed in the Death Company, painted black, and sent into battle on suicide missions, where his rage can be directed against the Emperor's enemies before it consumes him entirely. It is a mercy, of sorts, to die in battle as a member of the Death Company rather than be locked away to rage impotently until physical death finally comes. For a Blood Angel who has served for centuries, the knowledge that the Black Rage becomes more likely with each passing year is a source of constant dread. Every morning when he wakes, he must assess his own mental state, checking for the signs that the rage is beginning to claim him. Every battle carries the risk that the psychic pressure will become too much, that he'll see Horus where his actual enemy stands, that he'll lose himself in a past that isn't his own. Commander Dante himself is not immune to this. Despite his incredible age and his iron will, he knows that eventually the Black Rage will come for him too. It's not a question of if, but when. And when it does, when the oldest non-dreadnought space marine in the Imperium finally succumbs to the curse that has claimed so many of his brothers, it will mark not just his death, but the loss of 1,500 years of accumulated wisdom and experience. The Space Wolves face a different but equally troubling affliction. The Canis Helix, the modified gene seed that gives them their wolf-like characteristics, can become unstable in older Marines. The changes start subtly, enhanced senses becoming slightly more animal-like, aggression becoming harder to control, pack instincts becoming more pronounced. But in some cases, usually in Marines who have served for many centuries, the Canis Helix becomes dominant. The Marine begins to transform, his body changing to become more lupine, his mind regressing toward animal instincts. He becomes what the Space Wolves call wolfen, creatures that are more wolf than man, driven by instinct rather than reason. The wolfen are not lost, not entirely. They can still fight, can still serve the chapter, but they've sacrificed their humanity in the process, becoming living weapons that must be carefully directed lest they become a threat to their own brothers. For a space wolf who has fought with distinction for centuries, who has led his pack with wisdom and courage, the prospect of degenerating into a wolfen is a fate worse than death. Some older space wolves choose to go on their final hunt before the transformation can claim them, seeking death in battle while they're still themselves, rather than waiting to become monsters. Others accept the transformation, embracing it as another form of service to the Emperor. But there's always the awareness that this is a one-way change, that once the wolfen emerges, the warrior they were is gone forever. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters carry a different burden, one that's more psychological than biological, but no less damaging for that. The secret of the fallen, those members of their legion who turned traitor during the heresy, weighs heavily on every Dark Angel. But for those who have served for centuries, who have hunted the fallen across the galaxy for longer than most humans live, the secret becomes an obsession that consumes everything else. The oldest members of the inner circle, those who know the full truth about the fallen and have dedicated their existence to hunting them down, often become so focused on this mission that they lose sight of everything else. They see potential traitors everywhere. They become paranoid, suspicious, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to prevent the secret from being revealed. The longer they carry this burden, the more it warps their perspective, until they become instruments of a mission, rather than warriors with any kind of independent judgment. These chapter-specific afflictions add an additional dimension of horror to the concept of living too long as a space marine. It's not just that time erodes your humanity through accumulated loss and fading memory. It's that your own gene seed, the very thing that makes you a space marine, can become a source of degradation. The gifts that elevated you above normal humanity can become curses that drag you below it. For a marine who knows his chapter's afflictions, every year of extended service is a year closer to potential catastrophe. Every battle is not just a risk of death, but a risk of transformation, of succumbing to the genetic or psychological curses that wait for all who live too long. The awareness of this adds a particular kind of dread to the experience of aging as a space marine, a countdown to inevitable degradation that no amount of faith or discipline can ultimately prevent. And the chapters can offer no real solutions. The gene seed cannot be changed without losing the connection to the Primarch, without severing the link that makes a blood angel or a space wolf a space wolf. The curses are part of the package, inseparable from the gifts. All the chapters can do is manage the symptoms, try to delay the inevitable, and hope that their warriors find honorable deaths in battle before the curses claim them entirely. This is what it means to live too long with flawed gene seed. Not just to endure the normal erosions of extended life, but to carry within yourself the seeds of your own degradation, knowing that time is actively working against you, that the longer you survive, the more certain it becomes that you'll eventually fall not to the Emperor's enemies, but to the failures written into your own genetic code. Beyond the specific physical and genetic degradations, Beyond the chapter-specific curses, there's a more fundamental transformation that happens to Space Marines who live too long. They begin to lose the core of what makes them human, not just in the sense of biological humanity, but in the philosophical sense of being a person with individual identity, desires, and connections to others. This erosion of self happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. It begins with small changes in perspective, the kind that seem like natural maturation rather than fundamental transformation. A young Space Marine fights with passion, with a burning desire to prove himself, to earn glory, to make his chapter proud. An older Marine fights with discipline, with controlled aggression, with the understanding that individual glory matters less than the mission's success. This seems like growth, like wisdom gained through experience. And in a sense, it is. But it's also the first step in a process that, carried far enough, results in something that's more automaton than person. As the centuries pass, the Marine finds that he has fewer and fewer personal desires. The things that once mattered to him, the small pleasures that made existence worthwhile, gradually fade into irrelevance. Perhaps he once enjoyed the rituals of armor maintenance, finding a kind of meditation in the careful cleaning and blessing of his war gear. Now it's just another task to complete, performed with mechanical efficiency, but no real engagement. Perhaps he once valued the counsel of his brothers, sought their company during moments of rest, found meaning in the bonds of camaraderie that united the chapter. Now he goes through the motions of fellowship because it's expected, because it serves a tactical purpose in maintaining unit cohesion, but the genuine feeling of connection is gone. His battle brothers are resources to be deployed, rather than people to be known. Perhaps he once felt pride in his chapter's achievements, satisfaction when they succeeded in their missions, determination to uphold their honor and traditions. Now the chapter is just the organizational structure he operates within, a framework that gives purpose to his existence, but doesn't inspire any particular emotional response. This transformation is subtle because it doesn't manifest as dramatic change. The ancient Marine still performs all his duties, still fights effectively, still upholds the chapter's standards. But he does so from a position of complete emotional detachment, going through the motions because that's what he's programmed to do, not because he cares about the outcomes. And the truly insidious part is that this state can feel like liberation. Without emotional attachments, there's no grief when brothers fall. Without personal desires, there's no disappointment when those desires go unfulfilled. Without pride or shame, there's no psychological turmoil over successes or failures. The ancient Marine exists in a state of perfect emotional equilibrium, untouched by the passions and sorrows that trouble younger warriors. But this equilibrium comes at a terrible cost. What's left when you remove all emotional content from existence? What is a person without desires, without attachments, without any internal life beyond the execution of assigned tasks? The ancient Marine has not transcended humanity so much as evacuated it, leaving behind a shell that performs the functions of a warrior while containing nothing that could be called a self. The chapter serfs and younger Marines often can't tell that anything is wrong. They see an ancient warrior who is calm in crisis, unfailingly disciplined, completely focused on the mission. They interpret this as the pinnacle of Space Marine achievement, the ultimate expression of devotion to the Emperor and the chapter. They aspire to reach this state themselves one day, not understanding that what they're seeing is not achievement, but loss. Some ancient Marines are aware of what's happening to them. They can remember, dimly, what it felt like to actually care about things, to experience genuine emotions, rather than just intellectual understanding of what emotions they should theoretically be having. They recognize that they're losing something essential, that the person they were is being slowly erased. But recognizing it doesn't stop it from happening. The erosion continues regardless of awareness, driven by the simple reality that the human psyche cannot maintain full engagement with existence across timescales it was never designed to handle. The mind adapts by shutting down non-essential functions, and in the context of warfare, emotional and personal content is deemed non-essential. Other ancient Marines don't even realize what's been lost. They've transitioned so gradually from feeling person to functional automaton, that they can't remember what it was like to be different. They look at younger Marines and see emotional volatility that needs to be corrected through discipline, not recognizing that what they're seeing is normal human psychology that they themselves once possessed. The philosophical implications of this transformation are profound and disturbing. If a space marine who has lived for centuries has lost all the qualities that make a person, can we still say that the original individual exists? The body is maintained. The memories are preserved in some form. The name remains the same. But is this continuity of identity genuine? Or is it just an illusion, a label applied to something that has become fundamentally different? Some chapter chaplains grapple with these questions, trying to develop theological frameworks that preserve the dignity of ancient warriors while acknowledging their transformation. They speak of transcendence, of evolution beyond the limitations of mortal concerns, of becoming living weapons in the most literal sense. They frame the loss of humanity as a necessary sacrifice, another form of devotion to the Emperor. But there's a hollowness to these explanations, a sense that they're constructing justifications for something that's fundamentally tragic rather than glorious. The ancient Marine has not transcended humanity. He's simply lost it, piece by piece, until what remains is a biological machine executing its programming with perfect precision and zero understanding of why any of it matters. And the most horrifying aspect is that this process is, in many ways, adaptive. An ancient Marine who has lost all emotional content is, in some senses, a better warrior than one still burdened with human feelings. He won't hesitate in combat because of fear or doubt. He won't be distracted by grief or anger. He won't make decisions based on personal attachments that might compromise tactical effectiveness. He is the perfect soldier, completely focused, absolutely reliable, utterly without mercy or compassion, or any quality that might interfere with his function. The Imperium needs such warriors. In a galaxy of endless war, soldiers who can fight forever without psychological degradation are invaluable. So the erosion of self is not just tolerated, but implicitly encouraged. Ancient Marines are celebrated for their detachment, their focus, their transcendence of mortal concerns. The fact that they've ceased to be people in any meaningful sense is reframed as a virtue rather than a tragedy. This is perhaps the most terrible aspect of living too long as a space marine. Not the physical degradation, not the genetic curses, not even the psychological trauma of endless war. It's the slow transformation from person to weapon, the gradual evacuation of all internal life until nothing remains but function and duty, performed with perfect efficiency by a being that has forgotten why any of it ever mattered in the first place. The transformation from person to weapon, the accumulation of centuries of trauma, the loss of emotional connection, all of these factors combine to create a particular phenomenon among space marines who have lived too long. They begin to actively seek death, not from despair or cowardice, but from a simple, exhausted recognition that they've served long enough and want to rest. This is a delicate topic within the chapters, something that's acknowledged in practice but rarely discussed openly. The Imperium's official position is that to serve the Emperor is the highest honor, that every space marine should aspire to continue serving as long as physically possible. Death in battle is glorious, yes, but only when it comes naturally in the course of duty, not when it's actively pursued. But the reality is that many ancient Marines do pursue it, and the chapters have developed informal mechanisms to accommodate this while maintaining the fiction that it's not really happening. The death company of the Blood Angels is perhaps the most formalized version of this phenomenon. When a Blood Angel succumbs to the Black Rage, he's placed in the death company and sent on missions where death is not just likely, but virtually certain. This is framed as a way to direct the rage against the Emperor's enemies, to ensure that the fallen Marine's final acts serve the Imperium even as his mind is lost to madness. But look more closely at the composition of death companies, and you'll notice that they don't just include Marines who have succumbed to the Black Rage. They also include volunteers, Blood Angels who paint their armor black and join their raged brothers on suicide missions. The official explanation is that these volunteers are honoring their fallen brothers, choosing to fight alongside them in their final battle. The unofficial reality is that many of these volunteers are ancient Marines who have decided they've lived long enough. They haven't succumbed to the Black Rage themselves, but they use its rituals as a socially acceptable way to seek the death they desire. They fight alongside the truly fallen, knowing that this mission will almost certainly be their last. And when they fall, they're honored as heroes who chose to accompany their brothers into death rather than as warriors who were simply tired of living. Other chapters have similar mechanisms, though they're less formalized. When a particularly dangerous mission emerges, one that requires volunteers for what's essentially a suicide deployment, the ancient Marines often step forward. They're lauded for their courage, for their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the mission's success. Their deaths are mourned and commemorated. What's rarely acknowledged is that many of these Marines are seeking exactly this opportunity. They've waited for a chance to die with honor, to have their service end in a way that will be remembered and celebrated, rather than simply fading away in some unremarkable skirmish. When the suicide mission appears, they volunteer, not despite the near certainty of death, but because of it. The chapter leadership understands what's happening. They recognize the signs of a Marine who has decided his time has come, but they allow it because, pragmatically, it serves the chapter's needs. The dangerous mission needs volunteers anyway. Better to use warriors who actively want to die than to order younger Marines to their deaths. And the ancient Marines, with their centuries of experience, are often genuinely more likely to succeed at impossible tasks than younger, less experienced warriors, even if success means dying in the process. There's a kind of unspoken agreement that operates in these situations. The ancient Marine signals his readiness to die by volunteering for the mission. The leadership accepts this, deploying him with full knowledge that he's unlikely to return. When he falls, everyone celebrates his heroic sacrifice without acknowledging that it was, on some level, exactly what he wanted. This system works. After a fashion, it allows ancient Marines to end their service on their own terms, while maintaining the Imperium's official fiction that all deaths in battle are tragic losses, rather than desired releases. It ensures that suicide missions are staffed by the most capable warriors, those with the experience and skill to give the mission its best chance of success. And it prevents the buildup of too many ancient Marines who have mentally checked out, who continue to exist but no longer contribute meaningfully to the chapter. But there's something deeply sad about this entire arrangement. These are warriors who have given centuries of service, who have fought in countless battles, who have sacrificed everything for the Imperium. And the only reward they can hope for, the only relief available to them, is death. Not rest, not retirement, not any kind of peaceful ending. Just death, preferably in battle, framed as glorious sacrifice to obscure the fact that it's actually a mercy. Some ancient Marines don't even get this option. They're too valuable to risk on suicide missions, too essential to the chapter's functioning to be allowed to seek death, even indirectly. Commander Dante is a prime example. He has openly expressed his desire for rest, his weariness with centuries of service, but the Blood Angels cannot afford to lose him. His experience, his leadership, his deep understanding of the chapter's unique challenges, all of this makes him indispensable. So Dante continues to serve, continues to lead, continues to endure despite his desire for release. He is trapped by his own excellence, by the fact that he's too valuable to the Imperium to be granted the death he seeks. Every battle he survives is another victory for the Blood Angels, but another extension of his personal torment. Every century he continues to exist is another century he's denied the rest he's earned 1,000 times over. This is perhaps the cruelest fate of all for a Space Marine who has lived too long. Not to die in battle, which at least offers the satisfaction of a purpose fulfilled and a service completed. Not even to transform into a dreadnought, which offers periodic respites in sleep even if waking is torment. But to continue existing, fully conscious and aware, serving a function you no longer have any real investment in, unable to stop because the machine that is the Imperium will not release you from service as long as you remain useful. The death-seeking behavior of ancient Marines is a symptom of a deeper problem one that the Imperium cannot solve because it's built into the very foundation of what Space Marines are. They are created to serve forever, enhanced to endure centuries of combat, conditioned to accept endless war as their natural state. But the human psyche, even genetically enhanced and rigorously conditioned, cannot maintain this indefinitely. Eventually, the warrior wants to rest. Eventually, the weight of centuries becomes too much to bear. Eventually, death becomes not the enemy to be feared, but the friend to be welcomed, the only promise of peace in a universe that offers no other form of respite. And so the ancient Marines seek their end, hoping that when it comes, it will be glorious enough to justify their existence, meaningful enough to give purpose to the centuries of suffering they've endured, quick enough that they won't have time to regret that it didn't come sooner. When we step back and look at the full scope of what it means for a Space Marine to live too long, we're confronting something that goes beyond individual tragedy. We're looking at a fundamental flaw in the Imperium's approach to warfare, a crack in the foundation of the very system that's supposed to defend humanity against the darkness. Space Marines are created with a promise, explicitly stated or implied: serve the Emperor, and you will be honored. Fight for the Imperium, and your deeds will be remembered. Sacrifice your humanity to become a warrior, and that sacrifice will have meaning. You will be part of something eternal, something that matters, something worth the terrible price you've paid. For most Space Marines, this promise is kept, after a fashion. They serve for a few decades, fight in glorious battles, die heroically, and are remembered as heroes. Their sacrifice has a clear arc: transformation, service, death, remembrance. It's a narrative that makes sense, that provides meaning to what would otherwise be just violence and loss. But for those who live too long, the promise starts to break down. The clear narrative arc extends beyond its natural endpoint, stretching into a formless continuation that has no clear meaning or purpose. Transformation happened centuries ago. Service has been rendered 1,000 times over. Death refuses to come. Remembrance becomes hollow when the being remembered no longer resembles the person who earned that honor. What's left is just existence, stripped of the meaning that was supposed to make the sacrifice worthwhile. The ancient Marine continues to fight because that's what he does, because his conditioning and his biology drive him to continue, because the Imperium needs him to continue. But the why has been lost along the way, eroded by time and repetition, until it's just empty ritual performed by a being who has forgotten what made it sacred. This is the true horror of living too long in the 41st millennium. Not the physical pain, though that's real. Not the psychological trauma, though that's devastating. Not even the loss of self, though that's perhaps the most profound tragedy. The real horror is the recognition that the entire system is built on a promise that can only be kept if you die at the right time. And if you fail to die, if you continue to exist beyond your narrative's natural endpoint, the promise becomes a lie, and everything you've sacrificed is revealed to have been for nothing more than the continuation of a war that has no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. The galaxy is vast beyond human comprehension, containing billions of stars and untold numbers of worlds. The Imperium spans a significant portion of this immensity, and it is constantly under threat from every direction. Orcs mass in numbers that defy calculation. Tyranids consume entire sectors. Chaos tears at reality itself. The Tau expand. The Necrons awaken. The Eldar scheme. Countless other threats lurk in the darkness between stars. Against this backdrop, the sacrifices of individual Space Marines, no matter how prolonged or terrible, are statistically insignificant. The Imperium will continue its war regardless of whether Commander Dante finally finds the death he seeks or serves for another 1,000 years. The long war will grind on whether ancient dreadnoughts wake from their slumber or sleep forever. The battle never ends, the enemies never relent, and the suffering of those who fight is simply the cost of survival. For an ancient Marine who has achieved enough perspective to see this, who has lived long enough to witness the full scope of the Imperium's struggles, this realization is devastating. Everything you've done, every sacrifice you've made, every brother you've lost, every piece of yourself you've surrendered. It all amounts to nothing more than a temporary holding action against inevitable entropy. You are not a hero in any cosmic sense. You are a resource being consumed by a system that will continue to consume resources long after you're gone. Some ancient Marines respond to this realization with renewed faith, doubling down on their devotion to the Emperor, finding meaning in service itself rather than in any particular outcome. If the war is eternal, then eternal service is the only appropriate response. If the Imperium is constantly threatened, then constant vigilance is the only acceptable stance. They transform their despair into determination, their weariness into stoicism, their recognition of meaninglessness into a kind of defiant faith that service to the Emperor is its own justification. Others simply shut down emotionally. Which brings us back to the erosion of self we discussed earlier. If it all means nothing, if the war is endless and the outcome uncertain, then there's no point in investing emotional energy in any of it. Just execute your function. Kill the Emperor's enemies, follow orders, and don't think too much about the bigger picture. This is how you get ancient Marines who are functionally weapons rather than warriors. Beings who fight with perfect efficiency because they've abandoned any attempt to find meaning in what they're doing. And a very few, arrive at conclusions that the Imperium would consider heretical. They begin to question whether the endless war is really necessary, whether the Imperium's approach to galactic security is sustainable, whether the suffering inflicted and endured in the Emperor's name is truly justified by the outcomes it produces. These Marines don't usually voice these doubts openly, because to do so would mark them as potential traitors. But the doubts exist, growing in the back of minds that have seen too much, endured too much, to accept the simple certainties that comfort younger warriors. This is perhaps the deepest tragedy of living too long as a Space Marine. Not just to lose your humanity, not just to become weary and seek death, but to gain enough perspective to see the full scope of what you're part of and recognize that it's a machine grinding up everything fed into it, transforming human lives and human suffering into the raw material needed to sustain its own operation, generating no real purpose beyond its own continuation. The ancient Marine looks out at the galaxy and sees his younger brothers fighting with passion and conviction, believing that their battles matter, that their sacrifices have meaning, that they're defending humanity rather than just perpetuating a system that devours humanity to fuel itself. And he can't tell them the truth because the truth would break them, would rob them of the very faith that makes them effective warriors. So he stays silent, maintains the fiction, plays his role in the grand theatre of eternal war. This is what it means to have lived too long in Warhammer 40,000. To have served until you understand things that would have been better left unknown. To have endured until the comfortable lies that sustain younger warriors have been stripped away by the sheer weight of contrary evidence. To have existed long enough to see the patterns, to recognize the cycles, to understand that nothing really changes, that the war is the only constant, and everything else is just details that vary without altering the fundamental nature of existence, as an endless struggle that resolves nothing and accomplishes nothing except its own continuation. And having understood all this, to continue anyway, because what else is there to do? Because the conditioning runs too deep to overcome. Because some part of you still believes, or at least hopes, that the Emperor's vision had meaning, that humanity's survival justifies the cost, that your sacrifices and those of your brothers amount to something more than just fuel for an uncaring machine. Or perhaps because you've simply forgotten how to stop, forgotten what it would mean to exist for any purpose other than war, forgotten that there were ever alternatives to the life you're living. You continue because continuing is all you know, because the centuries have worn away everything else, until only the warrior remains, and the warrior knows only how to fight. This is the final truth about Space Marines who live too long. They become living monuments to the Imperium's failure to provide meaning for the sacrifices it demands. They are proof that the promise of glory and honor and eternal service eventually becomes a curse for those who fulfill it too well. They are warnings, walking reminders that there is such a thing as too much service, too much sacrifice, too much time spent in an existence that was never meant to extend indefinitely. The Imperium ignores these warnings. It has to. Acknowledging them would require fundamental changes to systems that cannot be changed, would demand alternatives that don't exist, would force a reckoning with truths that would undermine the very foundations of imperial society. So the ancient Marines continue to serve, continue to suffer, continue to endure existences that should have ended centuries ago, but somehow persist. And the Imperium continues to extract value from their suffering while celebrating them as heroes. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, this is considered not a tragedy but a triumph, the system working as designed, the ultimate expression of devotion to the Emperor, the highest honor a Space Marine can achieve. When you understand what it actually means, when you see past the propaganda to the reality of what these ancient warriors endure, you realize that living too long as a Space Marine isn't an honor at all. It's one of the most terrible fates imaginable, a slow-motion tragedy played out across centuries, a gradual erosion of everything that makes existence worthwhile, all in service to a war that will never end and a victory that will never come. This is what happens when a Space Marine lives too long in Warhammer 40,000. Not glory, not transcendence, not apotheosis into something greater than human, just a long, slow descent into emptiness, fought every step of the way by warriors who deserve better, but will never receive it, because in the Imperium of man, there is no rest for the faithful. Only war, eternal and unchanging, consuming everything fed into it, and producing nothing but more war in return. The relationship between ancient Space Marines and the newer generations creates its own particular form of suffering. Consider the experience of a veteran who has served for 500 years, being assigned to train fresh recruits, boys who have just completed their transformation into Space Marines. These recruits look at the ancient with reverence, seeing in him everything they aspire to become. They see a living legend, a warrior who has fought in battles they've only read about in the chapter's histories. They hang on his every word, eager to learn from his centuries of accumulated wisdom. The ancient, for his part, looks at these recruits and sees ghosts. He sees the faces of all the previous generations he's trained, all the young Marines who looked at him with the same reverence, who promised to honor the chapter's traditions, who swore they would never falter in their duty. He sees them because he's trained dozens, perhaps hundreds of these young warriors over the centuries, and he knows, with absolute certainty, what will happen to most of them. Within a decade, half of them will be dead. Within 2 decades, perhaps 3/4 will have fallen. The few who survive to reach veteran status will be fundamentally changed by the experience, hardened and scarred in ways that will make them unrecognizable as the eager recruits they once were. And the ancient will still be here, training the next generation, watching the same cycle repeat, with only the names and faces changing. There's a particular kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from this repeated experience. The ancient wants to invest in these recruits, wants to give them the best possible chance of survival, wants to pass on every scrap of knowledge and wisdom he's accumulated. But he also knows that most of them won't survive long enough for that knowledge to matter. He's making an emotional investment with a near certain negative return, and he's been doing it for so long that he's forgotten how to care about the outcome. So he goes through the motions of training, he demonstrates the proper techniques, corrects their mistakes, shares tactical insights that might save their lives someday. But he does it mechanically, without the passion that would make the lessons truly resonate. He's given this same lecture 100 times before to recruits who are now decades dead. The words have lost their meaning through repetition, becoming just sounds he makes because the training schedule requires it. The recruits don't understand this. They see his detachment as the stoicism of a seasoned warrior, interpret his emotional distance as the proper attitude of a Space Marine who has transcended mortal concerns. They try to emulate it, not realizing that what they're seeing is actually a kind of death, the death of the capacity to engage genuinely with other beings. And when these recruits inevitably die, when they fall in battle as the ancient knew they would, he attends their funeral rites with the same mechanical detachment he brought to their training. He speaks the words of remembrance because the ritual requires it. He promises to honor their memory because that's what you say. But he doesn't feel anything, can't feel anything, because he's done this too many times for it to have any real emotional impact. The younger veterans in the chapter notice this and assume that the ancient has achieved some higher state of being, that his lack of visible grief is evidence of his transcendence of mortal weakness. They aspire to reach this state themselves, not understanding that what they're seeing is not strength but emptiness, not transcendence but loss. This creates a terrible irony. The ancient Marines, who should serve as warnings about the cost of living too long, instead become role models for younger warriors who misinterpret their emotional death as spiritual achievement. The very symptoms of their degradation become virtues to be emulated, ensuring that the next generation of long-lived Marines will follow the same path to the same empty destination. The ancient himself is often aware of this irony. He sees younger Marines trying to emulate his detachment, trying to suppress their emotional responses in imitation of his example. He could tell them the truth, could warn them that what they're aspiring to is actually a kind of living death. But he doesn't, because what would be the point? If they live long enough, they'll reach this state anyway. Better to let them believe it's achievement rather than degradation. Better to maintain the fiction than to burden them with a truth they're not yet ready to understand. And so the cycle continues. Ancient Marines train new recruits with mechanical efficiency. The recruits aspire to become like their ancient teachers. Some survive long enough to achieve this aspiration, only to discover that what they've achieved is not the transcendent wisdom they imagined, but simply the emotional numbness that comes from outliving their capacity to care. They become the next generation of ancients, training the next generation of recruits, perpetuating a system that creates exactly the kind of suffering it claims to transcend. There's also the matter of how ancient Marines relate to the broader Imperium, to the mortal humans they're supposedly defending. When a Space Marine is young, fresh from his transformation, he still remembers what it was like to be human. He may have been just a child when he was selected for recruitment, but he has memories of normal human existence, of family and community, and the concerns that occupy mortal minds. These memories give him context for why he fights, help him understand what he's protecting. But as centuries pass, these memories fade. The ancient Marine can no longer remember what it felt like to be cold or hungry, or afraid in the way mortals are afraid. He's forgotten the texture of normal human relationships, the rhythms of ordinary life, the small joys and sorrows that make up human existence. The mortals he's sworn to protect have become abstract concepts rather than real people he can relate to. This creates a dangerous disconnect. The ancient Marine continues to fight for humanity, continues to defend Imperial worlds, continues to slaughter the Imperium's enemies. But he's lost the connection to what he's fighting for. Humans have become resources to be protected for strategic reasons, not people whose lives have inherent value. Planets are territory to be held, not homes where real people live real lives. Some ancient Marines try to maintain this connection by deliberately interacting with mortal humans, by serving as advisors to Imperial Guard regiments, or as liaisons to planetary governments. They hope that regular exposure to normal human behavior will help them remember what they're fighting for, will keep them grounded in the reality of the Imperium beyond the constant warfare. But even this doesn't really work. The gap between a centuries-old Space Marine and a mortal human is simply too vast to bridge. The concerns that dominate mortal life seem trivial to the ancient. The perspectives that shape mortal thinking seem naive. The emotional responses that are normal for humans seem like weaknesses that need to be overcome. The ancient tries to relate, but he's trying to remember a way of being that he left behind so long ago that he can barely recall what it felt like. This disconnection from humanity extends even to the chapter's own serfs and support personnel. These are the people who maintain the fortress monastery, who service the Space Marines' armor and weapons, who handle the administrative tasks necessary for the chapter to function. They're mortals, baseline humans who serve the chapter with devotion but will never become Space Marines themselves. Young Space Marines understand that these serfs are essential, that the chapter couldn't function without their service. They treat them with respect, If not exactly as equals, then at least as valued members of the chapter's extended family. But ancient Marines often struggle with this. They've outlived so many generations of serfs that they've started to see them as interchangeable, as positions to be filled, rather than individuals with their own identities and worth. The ancient might work with the same armorer for decades, but when that armorer dies and is replaced by his apprentice, the ancient barely notices the transition. They're just the armorer, whoever happens to fill that role. The fact that the previous armorer had served for 30 years, had children and grandchildren among the chapter's serf population, had hopes and dreams, and a full interior life. All of this is irrelevant to the ancient. All that matters is the function, and anyone can fill a function. This further reinforces the ancient's isolation. He exists in a bubble populated only by other space marines, and even they are kept at emotional distance. The mortals who surround him have become part of the background, barely distinguishable from the servitors and other automated systems that keep the fortress monastery running. He is alone in a crowd, disconnected from humanity, while supposedly serving as its greatest defender. The strategic perspective that comes with centuries of experience also creates its own problems. An ancient marine who has fought across dozens of sectors, who has seen the ebb and flow of galactic conflicts over centuries, begins to think in terms that transcend individual battles, or even individual wars. He sees patterns, cycles, the long-term trajectories of threats and responses. This broader perspective can be valuable. Ancient Marines often serve as strategic advisors to chapter masters, or even to Imperial command structures, providing insights that only long experience can offer. They can predict how enemies will respond based on behaviors they've observed over centuries. They can identify patterns in chaos that younger warriors miss. They can think in timeframes that span decades or centuries rather than just the immediate tactical situation. But this strategic perspective also reinforces their disconnection from the human cost of war. When you're thinking in terms of sector-wide campaigns that will unfold over decades, individual battles become just data points in a larger pattern. The Marines who die in those battles are just acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. The worlds that are devastated are just territory that changes hands in the eternal contest. The ancient knows, intellectually, that these data points represent real deaths, real suffering, real lives destroyed. But the emotional connection to that reality has been attenuated by the sheer scale of his perspective. He's seen too much, across too vast a canvas, for individual tragedies to retain their emotional weight. Everything becomes statistics, patterns, trends to be analyzed and responded to, rather than events to be felt and grieved. This creates a particular kind of horror when the ancient Marine is forced to confront the human consequences of strategic decisions. Perhaps a planet he designated as expendable in his strategic calculations turns out to be someone's homeworld. Perhaps a regiment he wrote off as acceptable casualties includes the son of a mortal officer he once knew. Perhaps a decision he made based purely on strategic considerations results in consequences that, when seen up close, rather than from strategic remove, are devastating in ways he didn't anticipate. In these moments, the ancient is forced to reckon with what he's become. He's not just lost the capacity to feel individual losses, he's lost the ability to recognize that strategic decisions have human consequences that matter beyond their impact on campaign objectives. He's become so focused on the big picture that he's forgotten that the big picture is composed of countless small pictures, each one representing lives that are as real and valuable as his own once was. Some ancient Marines, confronted with this realization, try to recalibrate, to remember that humanity means something beyond just strategic resources to be protected. But it's extraordinarily difficult to change thinking patterns that have been reinforced over centuries. The strategic perspective has become so deeply ingrained that it's effectively the only way the ancient knows how to think about warfare. He can understand intellectually that his approach is problematic, but he cannot actually change it, cannot force himself to feel the emotional weight of decisions he's been making without feeling for longer than most mortals live. And so the ancient continues to serve as a strategic advisor, continues to make decisions from his elevated perspective, continues to think in terms of acceptable losses and strategic necessities. But now he does so with the additional burden of knowing that he's lost something essential in the process, that the wisdom he offers is purchased at the price of his humanity, that every correct strategic decision is also evidence of how far he's fallen from the person he once was. The final consideration is what happens to the memory of ancient Marines after they finally die. Their names are added to the chapter's rolls of honor, their deeds recorded in the histories, their service celebrated in ritual and ceremony. They become part of the chapter's collective memory, examples held up to inspire future generations. But what's remembered is often not the reality of who they were. The histories record their victories, their tactical genius, their centuries of faithful service. They omit the weariness, the loss of humanity, the desperate longing for death that characterized their final centuries. The legend that survives is cleaner, more heroic, more suitable for inspiring young Marines than the messy reality of what they actually experienced. This creates a particular kind of tragedy. The ancient Marine, who finally dies after centuries of suffering, who has endured the slow erosion of everything that made existence worthwhile, becomes in memory the very thing he was not. A hero who gladly gave centuries of service, who never wavered, who embodied the Space Marine ideal without qualification or compromise. The reality of his experience is lost, replaced by a fiction that serves the chapter's needs, but betrays the truth of what he endured. And this fiction then becomes the standard that the next generation of Marines aspires to, perpetuating the cycle. Young Marines look at the legends of ancient heroes and think, I want to be like that, not understanding that what they're aspiring to is a sanitized version that omits all the horror. They volunteer for dreadnought interment. They volunteer for suicide missions. They dedicate themselves to centuries of service, all in pursuit of an ideal that never actually existed, except in stories designed to inspire rather than to inform. The ancient Marines themselves, in their final moments, often understand this. They know that they'll be remembered as legends rather than as the broken beings they actually became. They know that the truth of their experience will be lost, that future generations will make the same mistakes they made, will suffer the same degradations they suffered, all because the system requires heroes and cannot afford the truth. Some make peace with this. If the fiction serves the chapter, if it inspires young Marines to serve with devotion, then perhaps the distortion of their memory has value. Better to be remembered as a hero than as a warning. Better to inspire through legend than to demoralize through truth. Others find it profoundly unjust. They've suffered for centuries, have given everything, have endured horrors that should never be inflicted on any conscious being, and their reward is to be misremembered, to have their actual experience erased in favor of a more convenient fiction. They die knowing that no one will understand what they went through, that their real sacrifice will never be acknowledged, that the truth will die with them. But either way, the cycle continues. Ancient Marines die. They're remembered as legends. New Marines aspire to those legends. Some live long enough to discover the truth. They die and become legends themselves, and the machine grinds on, consuming human lives and human souls to produce the warriors the Imperium needs, regardless of what it costs those warriors to serve. This is the ultimate truth about what happens when a Space Marine lives too long in Warhammer 40,000. It's not just a personal tragedy, though it certainly is that. It's a systemic problem built into the very foundation of the Imperium's approach to warfare. The Space Marines are designed to be expendable, to die in battle before the costs of extended life become apparent. Those who fail to die on schedule become living evidence that the system is built on a lie, that the promise of glory and honor becomes a curse when fulfilled too completely. The Imperium cannot acknowledge this without undermining its own foundations. It cannot admit that its greatest warriors, its most celebrated heroes, are actually suffering in ways that make mockery of all the propaganda about service and sacrifice. So it maintains the fiction. It celebrates the legends. It sends young Marines off to pursue an ideal that will destroy them if they achieve it, all in service to a war that has no end, and a goal that has no meaning beyond the perpetuation of the system itself. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, this is considered normal. expected, even holy. The suffering of those who serve too long is the price of humanity's survival, and in the Imperium's calculus, any price is acceptable if it buys even a little more time, a little more territory, a little more resistance to the darkness that presses in from all sides. This is what it means to live too long as a space marine, to sacrifice not just your life but your humanity, not just your body but your soul, not just your present but your entire existence, all in service to a system that will consume everything you give and still demand more, until there's nothing left but an empty shell going through the motions of a life that ended centuries ago. If you found this exploration into the dark corners of space marine psychology compelling, if you want to see more deep dives into the horror that lurks beneath the surface of the Imperium's most celebrated warriors, please like and subscribe. There's so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps me continue bringing these stories to light. Until next time, remember, in the Emperor's service, even victory is just another form of suffering, and the only escape is a death that may never come.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.